Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Current Consulting Group and DrugPack. I'm Jessica Polk of the Current Consulting Group, and I will be conducting today's presentation entitled Why Drug Testing Series Part 2, The Value of Drug Testing Methodologies and Testing Panels. Today's presentation pre-qualified for continuing education credits from HRCI and from SHRM for those who attend today's presentation in its entirety. This presentation, as we mentioned, is part 2 of a 2-part series on why drug testing. Today's title is The Value of Drug Testing Methodologies and Testing Panels. But if you missed part 1, we'll go ahead and share the link to part 1 in the chat with you throughout today's presentation, and then you'll have that link with you if you'd like to view it at your convenience, or if you watched it before and you want a refresher, we're going to share that link with you. Before I turn the virtual microphone over to our presenter today, Bill Current of the Current Consulting Group, I wanted to invite you to watch a brief video about our sponsor today, DrugPack. If you have not taken a close look at DrugPack lately, or if you're a current user but haven't fully investigated all the advanced features they now offer, you'll enjoy this short video overview. DrugPack is a web-based, fully automated drug testing management system with dual objectives to help you save time and money by making your day-to-day operations as smooth as possible. We again want to thank today's sponsor, DrugPack, and if you have questions for them, we'll have some contact information for them later at the end of the presentation, but also you can learn more about them at drugpack.com. So with that, we'll keep moving along. And so we're going to switch back to our PowerPoint presentation by closing this video, and then we'll start sharing the PowerPoint again. But while we're switching screens, I'll go ahead and introduce our presenter today, Bill Current. Bill is the author of Why Drug Testing Updated and Expanded for 2020, as well as 9 other books on substance-related issues. He founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998, and it has become the #1 recognized brand name in compliance, business development, and operations consulting in the drug testing industry. He created Current Compliance, the most up-to-date and comprehensive online subscription database on all state law related to workplace drug testing, including marijuana and workers' compensation laws. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn the virtual microphone over to you, Bill.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. And I trust the slides are showing now, right?
That is correct.
Okay, perfect. Well, first of all, welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation. I want to just give a shout out to DrugPack to thank them for this partnership that we've had over several years of doing these webinars together. They're a great brand in the industry in the category of drug testing management software and cloud services. When we do our annual brand name recognition survey, which we've been doing for many, many years now at Current Consulting Group. But Drug Pack always scores #1 or #2 among the top 3 brands. And they do a lot of different things, and it's a real honor for us to be associated with them through these webinars and the other things that we do together. I also want to just invite you to ask any questions that you have. We're gonna touch on some very interesting things today. I think I would, if you have a chance, go back and watch part 1 of this series. There's some really good information in that. We're going to kind of take it to the next level today. Excuse me. And I invite you to ask any questions that you have on drug testing laws, state laws in particular, on the DOT regulations, anything related to drug testing. We're going to talk about drug testing methods, drug testing panels. We're going to talk about the return on investment of drug testing. I've dug up some really great statistics to share with you, some stats on the cost of drug abuse and how you might measure your return on investment in drug testing. Anything along those lines, feel free to ask a question about it. We've got some poll questions that we're going to do throughout today's presentation as well. So let's get started with the formal part of our presentation. I think it's very clear to everybody that marijuana laws are really changing the way employers look at drug testing. And in my mind, it feels like we're starting to move away from sort of traditional drug use detection toward impairment identification. Now, that doesn't mean that drug testing is going away. I don't believe that at all. In fact, I think drug testing is more important than ever. But there are certain laws that exist at the state level. I don't see the federal government legalizing marijuana in the immediate future, but there have been rumors and threats of that possibly happening, especially during the previous administration. But some state laws that legalize marijuana either for medicinal or recreational use include language that places additional requirements or conditions on employers who want to test for marijuana and or who want to take some type of adverse employment action if someone tests positive for marijuana. So I think going forward, we're going to see traditional drug testing methods. We're going to see alternative testing methods like oral fluid testing, rapid testing, and I think we're going to see non-drug testing impairment screening come into play as well. I think you'll see a combination of traditional drug testing and these newer methods of testing like oral fluid, which of course was endorsed by the Department of Transportation recently. We're still waiting for a couple of laboratories to become certified in order for covered or regulated employers to be able to rely on lab-based oral fluid testing. But that's creating a whole lot of surge and buzz toward oral fluid testing. I think we'll see a migration in that direction in the coming next year or 2 or 3, especially. But I think we'll see it as a combination in conjunction with impairment screening, especially in states that have legalized marijuana and have somewhat restrictive marijuana language in their laws. Now, impairment's an important issue. We're going to start there, right? Because we won't go through all of these bullets on the screen here, but if an individual is impaired, either by drug use or by sleep deprivation or by stress, or maybe they've got a new baby in the house and mom and dad aren't getting a full night's sleep and one or both of them are showing up to work the next day, sleep deprived, etc., that can create impairment. And impairment is an important issue. I'm going to share some stats on the next screen here. But before we move to that, when you think about the different impact or effects that impairment has on a person's ability to do what you've hired them to do or what your clients have hired them to do, you can see where impairment becomes a very critical issue. Now, there was a survey done by the National Safety Council where they asked employers about various impairment issues. 33% said that they consider impairment or its impact on their organization, their workplace in terms of safety, retention, productivity, finances, and reputation as a critical issue. 68% said that they view impairment as a justifiable reason to fire someone. And 77% said impairment is an important consideration when determining someone's fitness for duty. Now, I thought it was somewhat alarming that only 13%, or that 13%, I shouldn't say only, as many as 13% said they did not consider impairment an important consideration when determining fitness for duty. It's really a huge consideration, right? not only someone's physical ability to lift heavy objects or to operate a crane or a forklift or those types of things, but also just their ability to understand directions that have been given to them, understand instructions on how to operate machinery safely, and then to function within the scope of their employment safely and do the things that you've hired them to do. So 13% I thought was really way too high in that category. Now, there's a lot of talk nowadays about the impact of marijuana impairment. And so if you go online and you look up marijuana impairment, how long does it last, what causes it, etc., you'll find tons and tons of information out there. But the one that really stuck out to me was a report that was done out of the University of Sydney. This was just a few years ago, where they looked at 80 different studies from around the world on cannabis impairment. And starting with that second bullet, depending on how much THC is taken, how it's taken, right? Whether it's smoked or it's chewed with gummy bears or something like that, and the person taking it, whether they're a regular drug user or occasional drug user, et cetera, and what their body build is, et cetera, they found cognitive impairment could last between 3 and 10 hours. A more typical duration of impairment, however, is 4 hours, when lower doses of THC are consumed via smoking or vaporization and simpler tests are undertaken. Now look at that last bullet. This impairment may extend up to 6 or 7 hours if higher doses of THC are inhaled, okay, and complex tasks such as driving are assessed. So if you're an employer or you're a drug testing provider and you work with employers that hire drivers, excuse me, then this should be of concern to you, right? There are surveys that have come out in the last couple of years that show that the percentage of individuals who smoke marijuana on their way to work is significant. It's something like 38% of marijuana users admit that they consume marijuana on their way to work in the morning or on the way to work for their shift, whenever in the day that takes place. So if they're showing up having just smoked 1 or 2 joints on the way to work, and they're gonna, work as an 8-hour shift for you, they probably are impaired. They're at least under the influence, and they definitely have marijuana in their system. And I'm gonna talk about how you can drug test to detect that very, very recent use. But I said we'd have a few poll questions. So let's go to this first poll question. Jessica, why don't you take over the poll question, ask it, and then reveal the results, and then I'll take it over again.
No problem. Okay, so our first poll question is, do you test for marijuana? And so I'm going to launch that question for us right now. Go ahead and share with us your thoughts. Yes, but we're considered dropping it, or no. So pretty straightforward options. And so 78% said yes, they test for marijuana. No one is considering dropping it on this particular question. And we had 22% said no, they do not test for marijuana. So I'll go ahead and hide this and send it back to you, Bill.
Right. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everybody for sharing your thoughts on that. Very interesting. So now we're going to take a look at drug testing methods, and it says federally endorsed testing methods, but we're going to look at a few others as well. So right now there are lots of drug testing methods to choose from. There's traditional lab-based urine testing, but there's also instant or rapid result or point of collection, whichever terminology you choose for urine testing. There's hair testing, which is typically a lab-based test. There's lab-based oral fluid testing, which is what DOT has approved. And then there's instant or rapid result oral fluid testing. So every year, the Current Consulting Group conducts 2 surveys. For 27 years now, we've conducted a survey of the drug testing industry. And over the last 9 years, this is our 9th year, we've conducted a survey of employers on their drug testing practices. So in our 2024 employer drug testing survey, which we released at the SAPA conference, we asked the question, what drug testing methods do you currently use in your workplace program? And as you can see, very predictable, that long blue line there, 92% said lab-based urine testing. Now, they could choose whichever options apply. So they could choose more than one, and that's very common, right? So just above it, 45% said instant urine testing. And below that, 22% said instant oral fluid, and 31% said lab-based oral fluid testing, for a total of 53% saying that they use some form of oral fluid testing. Now, I emphasize the oral fluid part of it because we've been doing this survey for a lot of years. This will be our 9th annual employer drug testing survey. And we've been doing the industry survey for 27 years, where we ask, what drug testing methods do you currently offer? And which drug testing methods are you considering offering in the future? And this 53% combined for oral fluid is a significant increase from where we were even 5 or 6 years ago before COVID. In October of 2019, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, came out with final regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing of federal employees. And then later, DOT came out with their final regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing of DOT mandated or covered employees, truck drivers, airline pilots, etc. Now, those are pending, as I said earlier, on at least 2 laboratories becoming certified to conduct oral fluid testing. And I think that's really sort of on the verge. Some of you may be aware that back in April, we announced that Patrice Kelly, the longest standing director of the ONDCP, the office within DOT that oversees drug testing, has come to work for the Current Consulting Group. We're very excited and proud of that. And so she's got some inside tracks, and she's not predicting that this is on the verge of happening, but we do know that there are 2 labs that are very close to being certified to do oral fluid testing. So we think that's right around the corner now. It's been a little bit in the works, and there's a little, there've been a lot of rumors one way or the other, but it points to the fact that these regulations from DOT are sort of moving employers toward the idea of doing oral fluid testing. Now, when SAMHSA came out with their final regulations in October of 2019, they predicted that within about 4 to 5 years, probably in that range, basically, let's say 3 to 4 years, that somewhere around 25 to 30% of all federal employee testing would migrate to oral fluid testing. And they predicted the same would be true with DOT testing when that occurred. We believe now, from our surveys and the insights that we're getting from drug testing providers as well as employers, that percentage is probably going to be higher, closer to 35 to 40% over the next, say, 3 to 5 years. Now, when you look at federally endorsed drug testing methods, there's really just 2. There's lab-based urine testing and there's lab-based oral fluid testing. I put hair testing in red because there was a notice of proposed rulemaking that was issued in 2020 from SAMHSA, but we've really not seen much movement on that. And unfortunately, through all the different cuts and cutbacks that are occurring within the federal government, DTAB, the Drug Testing Advisory Board, has been shut down. And that is a group that would play a very instrumental role in providing a recommendation to move forward with any new drug testing method. And so we'll see what happens with hair testing. That NPRM is out there, but we're not hearing a lot about it. I wouldn't be surprised if something happens maybe in the next year or 2. But right now we have lab-based urine testing. That's, as I showed on the previous slide, the #1 drug testing method. We also have lab-based oral fluid testing right on the horizon, waiting for those 2 labs to get certified. But that was a major, major event when DOT came out with those final regulations, because it had been 30 years since lab-based urine testing was endorsed by the federal government for DOT regulated testing. So to add another testing method after all of this time is a huge, huge event. And Patrice Kelly, who I mentioned has come to work for Current Consulting Group, she helped write those regulations. She really was the driving force behind writing those oral fluid regulations. And so we have a lot of insight on oral fluid testing. That's why within our company, we believe it's going to go in that direction. We're going to see a migration toward oral fluid testing. Now, these next 3 slides, I'm not going to go through in great detail, but you're going to have them when you review the recording of today's presentation. But the advantages and challenges of lab-based urine testing, the same for oral fluid testing, and the same for hair testing. So let me just back up for a second. Let me say this about lab-based urine testing, because I have been talking about alternative testing methods, meaning testing methods other than lab-based urine testing, for many, many years. I've probably written more articles on oral fluid testing, for example, and have given more presentations on alternative testing methods than anybody in the drug testing industry. Lab-based urine testing is solid. It's a great way to go, right? but it's a little bit under attack, right? It's prone to drug test cheating methods. Various subversion methods are very common. A whole cottage industry has come into existence on the internet, offering advice and products to help people cheat on a urine test. But also look at that, what is it, the second bullet from the bottom, right? 2 states, California and Washington, passed laws that went into effect January 1st, 2024, that prohibit employers from taking action against individuals who test positive for marijuana when using a drug testing method that is only capable of revealing the presence of the metabolite of cannabis, as opposed to the parent drug, the drug itself. Now, in California, those restrictions apply to both pre-employment and post-hire testing, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, random, etc. In Washington, that restriction only applies to pre-employment testing, and there's a long list of exceptions for various safety-sensitive occupations. The reason I bring it up here in the context of talking about lab-based urine testing is that lab-based urine testing is solid, it's endorsed by the federal government, it's permitted legally in every state. When you're using a SAMHSA certified laboratory in particular, you're really on safe legal defensibility ground. But in California and Washington, because urine only detects the metabolite of cannabis, then you can't use it to test for marijuana in California at all, right? With the exception of construction industry, which there was some language in their law that exempts the construction industry from those restrictions. And in Washington for pre-employment testing, except for that long list of exceptions, right? However, even if the lawmakers in those states thought they were creating a law that would prohibit drug testing for marijuana, they left a giant loophole, which is that with oral fluid testing, you're not detecting the metabolite, you're detecting the parent drug. You're detecting delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the parent drug. And that becomes detectable very recent after use, within minutes. I'll get into that in a second. So in California and Washington, you can still test applicants and employees for marijuana and take adverse employment action based on a negative result, given other conditions and restrictions that may apply in California. Talk to your attorney about that if you're using oral fluid testing, okay? Now, there are challenges that come with urine testing, like shy bladder issues and drug test cheating, matching the gender of the donor and the collector if an observed collection is required, etc. But with oral fluid testing, almost all of those challenges don't apply, but you may run into some states like Vermont and Hawaii who don't allow for lab-based oral fluid testing. Instead of shy bladder, you sometimes run into dry mouth issues. You don't have the gender matching with observed collections. The nice thing about lab-based oral fluid testing today is that you have those federal regulations from the Department of Transportation to serve as your blueprint. And so at the state level, no 2 states have the same drug testing law. Let's be clear on that. But many states do sort of punt on the procedural issues of drug testing and simply defer to Part 40, the SAMHSA Part 40 rate, or to DOT. They'll use various terminologies, but it's all sort of pointing back to Part 40 under the federal regulations. Well, now that lab-based oral fluid testing is part of Part 40 and permitted by DOT, even though we're still waiting for those 2 labs to get certified, you can see where in some states where you may have thought that the state law was problematic when it came to oral fluid testing, that's not really the case anymore. So when you look at the advantages, it's a fairly long list because the collections are easier to do. You can train employees to be able to observe the collection process because you're not securing a private bathroom, you're not turning off the hot water or putting blue dye in the toilets, etc. All of those concerns go away with oral fluid testing. But you do want to be concerned if you're in Vermont or Hawaii, you want to make sure, talk to your attorney about this, that in the state where you're going to be conducting oral fluid testing, you can use those DOT regulations, which I'm sure is the case almost everywhere, as a blueprint for putting your program together. Now, the other testing method I want to just touch on for a moment is hair testing. It's different. I'm going to show you a graphic here in a minute on the windows of detection. So let me hold off on talking about that in great detail. But hair testing is different. Whereas with oral fluid testing, you're detecting drug use within minutes after somebody smokes a joint. With hair testing, you've got a lag time of, say, 6-7 days, maybe even up to 10 days before the drug becomes detectable in a hair sample. So it's more of a lifestyle drug testing method, whereas oral fluid testing is more of a recent use, make a connection or a nexus to impairment. No drug test proves that somebody's impaired, but the closer you can get to that, time in which the person consumed the drugs, and within that window of impairment that we talked about from that University of Sydney study, the more likely that you can use the drug test result in combination with other elements to take adverse employment action. Now, I want to say one last thing because I want to say something about rapid testing, because most of the information we have in the slide presentation is about lab-based testing. But in our survey of the drug testing industry, so the one that just came out in April, which we presented at the NDASA conference, you can see there's 68% of respondents said they believe that POCT or rapid result drug testing, whether with urine or oral fluid, will increase in the next 3 years. 28% said it'll at least stay the same. Only 5% felt it would go down. I think point of collection or rapid result or on-site or instant, whatever terminology you prefer, I believe that's going to be a growing part of how employers address drug abuse in the workplace, especially if you're in, say, a very tight hiring market and you're competing for jobs. You still want to do a drug test to screen that individual before you hire them, but you don't want to send them away to an offsite collection facility to void a urine sample because they may not even show up there, or they may just go down the street to apply for a job elsewhere because their objective that day is just to get a job. If you can do a rapid test, say with oral fluid testing, you can do a same-day test, same-day offer of employment when the individual tests negative. So let's move on. We're going to talk about detection windows and drug test panels here. Now, we've got another poll coming up here in just a few slides. So what to look for when choosing a drug test method. These are the main things, right? But the one issue that really grabs a lot of attention nowadays is window of detection. And so when you look at the various testing methods that we've talked about today, urine, oral fluid, and hair, you want to look at those list of characteristics and see which ones align with your needs as an employer. So let's just look at the top line. We won't go into detail here, but let's look at the top line. Lab-based or on-site rapid result, or POCT as some people call it, is available for urine. Both are available for urine. Both are available for oral fluid. Hair testing is traditionally considered a lab-only test. Now, there is a company out there, Wanfo, that has a rapid hair processor, and that's growing in popularity in the criminal justice arena, in drug courts, family courts, etc. So that may be something to look at. Right now, we're just showing it as lab only, but there is that technology out there. Very common, though, as you saw in that one result from our survey, urine and oral fluid in common use in fairly significant percentages as both a lab-based or as an on-site option. And probably in many cases, employers are combining the two technologies, lab-based with on-site, depending on the circumstances of the test. The other thing is the window of detection. Now, I've got a chart coming up on this here in a second, which will illustrate what I'm about to say. But with urine testing, you're looking at a 3 to 4 day window of detection at the cutoff levels that we typically use. So when you hear somebody say that marijuana remains detectable in somebody's urine sample for 2 or 3 weeks, that's true. But at the cutoff levels that your lab is using, you're only going to get a positive reported probably within a 3 to 4 day window of detection. Now, with oral fluid, a lot depends on whether it's a lab-based test or a point of collection rapid test, and whether it's marijuana or some other drug. So, for example, with a rapid result or PCT oral fluid test, you're looking somewhere in the range of about 12 hours for marijuana, THC. If it's lab-based, you're looking at 24 hours, maybe a little longer for THC. So a lot depends on whether it's a rapid test or a lab-based test. And then about 24 to 48 hours for other drugs. Just again, depends on the cutoff levels that your lab is using. There are cutoff levels in the DOT/Part 40 regulations that I believe will become the standard, right? Even if labs were doing something different in the past. I think we'll see that. Now, there's a big difference between the cutoff levels with a rapid oral fluid test and a lab-based oral fluid test. And that may be important to you if you're in a state that's legalized marijuana and you're looking for a little bit of latitude when it comes to as required by the law that applies to you. Say you're in Colorado, for example, You're looking for a little latitude on the window of detection for marijuana because in that state, marijuana users have very strong rights. California, Washington, Oregon, the same, and other states as well. The ability to detect recent use just below that is only really available with oral fluid testing. Now, oral fluid testing scientifically mimics blood. So if you were taking a blood sample and somebody smoked a joint an hour ago, that marijuana, that THC would be detectable in that individual's blood. Oral fluid mimics blood in that sense. In other words, marijuana, other drugs become detectable within minutes after usage. Whereas I explained with hair testing, you've got a lag time of say 7 to 10 days. And with urine, you've got a lag time of maybe 6 to 7 hours. With oral fluid and blood, although blood's not practical and not even permitted in many states for workplace testing, but with oral fluid testing, you're detecting the drug in the system within minutes after somebody has used the drug. So let's look at this graphic here. This paints a really clear picture. So you got breath, and by that I'm not talking about breath alcohol. I'm talking about the more recent breath THC tests that are out there, and I'll comment on that in a second. Blood, as I mentioned earlier, oral fluid, urine, and hair. Now, if you look to the far left of the chart, you can see that blood and breath and oral fluid are all right there on top of each other to the far left. That means that within minutes after usage, that drug use becomes detectable in a breath sample for THC, blood, or urine. Now, we know that oral fluid testing as a methodology has been endorsed by the federal government, but it's lab-based oral fluid testing. But still, the ability to detect recent use with a lab-based oral fluid test is there. It's solid. Same with blood. Now with breath, the technology really hasn't come to fruition. I think there's one company still out there. One, Hound Labs, I think went out of business. Cannabix is out there still with a lab-based breath test, I believe. But the problem with breath is that the ability to detect THC in a breath sample diminishes quickly after the first hour. So with oral fluid, you've got a solid window of detection from within 15 minutes after usage for about a day or two, depending on the type of test, POCT versus lab-based, et cetera. Lots of factors factor in. But you've got a solid window of detection, and that's really important because if you consider, the issue within the context of impairment, you want a drug testing method that covers the whole window of impairment. We're talking about window of detection, but think about it in terms of window impairment. So window of impairment for cannabis, as we talked about, was 3 to 10 hours. So if that's important to you, you want a drug testing method that is capable of detecting THC, in this case THC, cannabis, for that entire 3 to 10 hours. From the moment that somebody used the drug for 3 to 10 hours. And, there was some variation in the results from the Sydney report. With urine, you're going to miss those first 6 or 7 hours, right? Because the metabolite's not detectable in urine for about 6 or 7 hours. With breath, you've got about a 1 to 3 hour window of detection, but it's going to diminish quickly after the first hour. So you're going to get probably very few positives around the third hour. Now, the folks at Cannabix or some other company could tell us more about that, and that would be great to learn more about it. I think it's a technology with a lot of promise. Unfortunately, one of the big names went out, kind of went away, and so we don't really have a lot being promoted there. Besides that, though, the federal endorsement of oral fluid testing is really the thing that's making oral fluid testing, just really pop when it comes to interest among employers and providers actually offering oral fluid testing. And this is something you can look at later when you've got time to pause the screen when you look at the recording. But this gives you sort of that impairment duration window when it comes to not just cannabis, but cocaine, methadone, etc. So let's pause for a moment and do our next poll question, Jessica.
Sounds great. Okay, here we go. Our next poll question asks us, do you use any type of non-drug testing impairment screens? So we'll launch your options here. Yes, no, but we're considering it. No, but we'd like to learn more. Or no, it's not right for our company. So your thoughts, we're going to share our responses. So yes, 12% use a non-drug testing impairment screen. 15% said no, but they're considering it. 39% would like to learn more, and 33% said that it's not right for their company. So I'll hide these and send it back to you, Bill.
All right, thank you, Jessica. And we've talked a lot about marijuana up to this point. We're going to kind of switch gears and talk about drug test panels, which of course marijuana comes into play there. I do want to answer one question that was already put in the chat. And I know some of you may have joined us a little bit late, so let me extend the invitation again to ask any questions you have about drug testing, whether it deals with things that we talk about today or something else related to it, state drug testing laws, etc. Well, if we can't get to your question today, then I will respond in an email to you, but please feel free. But one question was submitted from Sid, said, what is the status of the rescheduling of marijuana with the DEA? That is an excellent question. So as you may know, last year, the Drug Enforcement Administration under the Biden administration decided to put out a proposed rulemaking that would reschedule marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. Basically, what that means is that a Schedule 1 drug is a drug that has no known medical benefits, is highly prone to addiction, and abuse of the drug can be harmful. Now, we could argue that abuse of any drug can be harmful, right? But these are drugs like marijuana, cocaine, heroin, etc. They're Schedule 1 drugs. Doctors cannot prescribe a Schedule 1 drug. A Schedule 3 drug can be prescribed by a doctor. Banks can deal in transactions involving Schedule 3 drugs, etc. So if you had moved marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, it could suddenly be prescribed by doctors. Whereas now, the way state laws get around that is by authorizing doctors to recommend marijuana for various ailments, including stress and anxiety. If that changes, then the Department of Transportation would no longer have the authority to require covered employers to test for marijuana, which they currently do, which is the #1 drug of abuse, which it has more of a connection to workplace accidents, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of stats on that. Look at the Quest drug testing index data from the last several years. You'll see lots of evidence of that proves that point. But the NDASA, which is one of the premier associations in the world of drug testing, and I happen to serve on the board, so I'm biased there, I'll admit. And I'm also on the board of trustees of the NDASA Foundation. I'm very proud to be part of the leadership at NDASA. We went about getting a safety carve-out included in that DEA proposal to reschedule marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. And so when lawmakers and people within the administration found out that testing for marijuana would have been prohibited under the DOT regulations if that change had been made, then everybody was sort of up in arms and we were able to get that change. However, in the meantime, the issue has kind of gone to sleep. I'm not saying it won't come back, but it's not moving forward at this time. The scheduled hearing, which NDASA was going to be part of, Joe McGuire was going to be part of that. She's the executive director at NDASA. It did not come to pass. And so I'm not ready to predict it's going to resurrect itself, but that can always happen. But it's sort of dormant right now. I'm not saying it's dead, but it's definitely, sort of on death's doorstep right now. But that's a great question, Sid. Thank you for asking that. So let's move on here, talk about drug test panels just for a moment. A drug test panel is the terminology used for the drugs that are included in the test that you do, right? And so that could be influenced by lots of things, state laws that apply to you, federal regulations, the drugs that people are using in your area. A typical SAMHSA drug test panel includes amphetamines, cocaine, marijuana, opiates, and phencyclidine, or PCP. There are other drugs, right? And you probably saw in the news that there is some, or in the past, that added to the SAMHSA 5, which is kind of there's more than 5 drugs included in the panel, but we often call it the SAMHSA 5. There was the addition of semi-synthetic opioids like hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, oxymorphone. You see all the brand names below that. And then lots of employers choose to test for barbiturates and benzodiazepines in particular, but there are other drugs as well. that can be added to a drug test panel, so it can quickly become, you know, a 9 or 10 or 11, 12 panel test, meaning 12 drugs included in the drug test. And then very, very recently, movement within the federal government to add fentanyl to the federal drug test panel, at least for the testing of federal employees. That may or may not happen. I'm not sure everybody in the federal government's really in favor of that, but there's a lot going on when it comes to panels and fentanyl in particular, because of its potent nature and really fatal, the fatal statistics that are out there right now relative to fentanyl poisoning and fentanyl overdoses. So when people ask me, you know, which drug should we test for, because it does affect the cost of your test. The price of your test will go up if you're testing instead of 5 drugs, you're testing for 12 drugs. Okay, that could have an impact on the test or the price that the laboratory charges you. But if you're asking me, I say test for the drugs that people are using, and they use a lot of different drugs. So keep that in mind when you're making that decision. Now, I want to make sure that we spend at least 5 minutes on this, and then we'll close. Evaluating your return on investment. I've looked up a lot of stats for this to make sure that we've got up-to-date statistics. You look at the bottom, you'll see the sources for those statistics. The truth of the matter is drug users don't like drug testing. 30% said they're less likely to apply for a job with a company that does pre-employment testing. That's a strong argument in favor of doing drug testing. And then employers recognizing the benefits, 87% said they believe it improves safety in the workplace, 63% it helps them hire better quality employees, etc. And in the world of treatment experts highly recommend drug testing as a way to help people stay on a drug-free path. And so drug testing works. It's been in place for, you know, going on 35, 40 years, and it just works. It's a powerful deterrent and a very effective way to identify people who need help. But from a business perspective, we have to look at the cost, right? And so a study out of the University of Chicago concluded that the average annual cost of each substance abusing employee is almost $8,900, $8,817, right? That's from turnover, lost productivity, accidents, medical expenses, etc. $8,800 per drug abusing employee. Okay. Now there's lots of different ways to look at this. Okay, I'm just running a bunch of numbers by you now, but I'm going to get somewhere with this. So, because marijuana users are more likely to cause a workplace accident, file a workers' comp claim, they're 5 times more likely to file a workers' comp claim, then you have to look at it from that cost standpoint, right? If you take substance abuse globally, $176.5 billion from work-related injuries, and you factor in the cost per worker of about $1,000, and then you look at the average cost of a worker death being $1.46 million, and the average cost of a medically consulted injury at $43,000, and the fact that marijuana using employees are 3.6 times more likely to cause a workplace accident and 5 times more likely to file a workers' compensation claim, you can see that that original number we were looking at here of $8,817 can quickly climb into the tens of thousands and maybe even tragically in the millions of dollars, depending on the type of accident and the damage or harm that came out of it, right? Now, the average cost of a workers' comp claim in between 2017 and 2018 was about $44,000. In fact, that 2017-2018 is not accurate. That should be 22-23. So that's a typo on my part. This is the latest data that's available. $44,179. If it's a motor vehicle related crash or accident, you're looking at over $90,000 as the average workers' comp claim, again, for 2022-2023. I talked about some of these statistics. Drug users are 3.6 times more likely to be involved in an accident, 5 times more likely to file a workers' comp claim. The medically consulted injury, $43,000, a workers' comp claim, $44,000. And then the average cost of a drug test, let's say, is $40. You may be paying more, okay? You may be paying less. Drug test prices are based on a lot of things, right? Like how many drugs you're testing for, where the collection takes place, how many drug tests you do in a year. So a lot of things factor into it. Let's say it's $40, right? You're paying $40, okay? $40 for a pre-employment drug test to avoid hiring somebody who on average is going to cost you about $8,800. All right. And if you screen out those individuals, you're avoiding the increased possibility of an accident, resulting in a medically consulted injury, maybe even a vehicle accident that's going to cost you even more, $90,000. Heaven forbid, a fatality in the workplace. Let's not go there for now. Many workers' compensation regulations at the state level allow you, the employer, to move to deny a workers' comp claim if you have a positive drug test or alcohol test result to use as evidence, according to the state, that the individual was impaired or under the influence at the time of the accident. Now, technically, from a legal and scientific standpoint, the drug test may not prove somebody's impaired, but at the state level in those workers' comp laws, and most states have this in their workers' comp law, they consider a positive drug or alcohol test to be evidence that the individual was responsible for their accident and that the employer should not be held responsible financially. So they can move to deny that claim. If you drop marijuana, for example, from your drug test panel, which is the #1 drug of abuse and the #1 drug that people test positive for, you're reducing any chance you have of being able to contest a workers' comp claim. So a lot going on there. That's what I just said on that previous slide. Some states, as I mentioned earlier, require some additional evidence that an individual may have been impaired at the time of an accident or at the time that they tested positive for marijuana, in addition to the positive drug test result. So a pattern of aberrant behavior, recklessness, workplace violence, etc., documented by your supervisors, in addition to a positive drug test result, or a non-drug test impairment exam that concludes that the individual is impaired. Those things all together can give the employer all that they need to be able to take adverse employment action. They're not relying solely on a drug test result. It may be a combination of other things. So keep all of that in mind when you're looking at it. But I love this slide. This is our last slide here. But if you look at it this way, right? You're going to do, let's say, well, let's go down to where it says further. Further, if those 100 substance abusing applicants had been hired, the ones that you weeded out by doing pre-employment drug testing, who would have cost you $8,800 times 10, it's a lot of money, right? If those 100 substance abusing applicants had been hired and ended up causing an accident, you can see all the way those costs add up. It's really dramatic. Excuse me. So that concludes the formal part of our presentation. We have a few minutes left for Q&A, but before we do that, there's one last poll question for you.
Thanks, Bill. All right. We are on to our last poll question. Do you consider drug testing beneficial? So let's get your opinions here. Yes, very much. Yes, but not sure how. No, not really. Or no, I wish we didn't do it. So your thoughts? We appreciate your feedback and participating in our polls today. We have 97% said yes, very much. 3% said yes, but not sure how. And with that, we'll turn it back to you, Bill.
Okay, so we've got just a few minutes left. Please send in your questions. I'll start with a couple of questions that we have, and then if you have some questions, send them in. If we don't get to all of them, I promise we'll respond in an email to you. So one question is, if the federal government legalizes marijuana, what will become of state marijuana laws? That's a great question, right? Because some of those laws contain restrictive language when it comes to the workplace that the federal government is very, very unlikely to include in any kind of federal bill or legislation that legalizes marijuana or decriminalizes it. And I'll comment on the decriminalization aspect of that here in a second. Those marijuana laws would still be in place. It may become legal to use marijuana federally, or there may be some like maybe private use or personal use amount of marijuana that it's legal to possess. You may be able to cultivate marijuana on your property with, 1 or 2 plants, etc. The federal government's just not going to go into a lot of detail. They're not going to put language in there that puts restrictions on employers. So where a federal law would end and would take precedence over a state law. Where that ends, the state law language would probably still come into play. So there might still be restrictions in states like Illinois and Colorado when it comes to what employers can do with a positive drug test result. Usually those laws contain what we call non-discrimination language, where it becomes unlawful for employers to discriminate against a legal user of marijuana, a sort of, if you will, a card-carrying registered medical marijuana user, for example. And that also creates a little bit of a dilemma for employers because, and we got this question just the other day here at our consulting group, where somebody wanted to know, what if somebody is applying for a job, we do a pre-employment test, they test positive for marijuana, and they show their medical marijuana card. Now, two things come into play. One, make sure it's a legitimate medical marijuana card, because that's also a new cottage industry, is creating false medical marijuana cards where somebody doesn't actually register with the state. They purchase a fake card from a various source, online or locally. So make sure of that. But two, and I can't answer the question on this webinar because two, it would depend on the state and what that state law says about non-discrimination. So it would have to be answered on a state-by-state level, but it's a very interesting angle. Now, one thing I'll add to my overall answer here is that a few years ago in Oregon, voters voted in a new law that decriminalized all illicit drugs, cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, etc. And there were certain conditions that would apply to a user where they had to get treatment, etc. But the law just didn't work. They thought that they would be helping a lot of people who were using the drugs by getting them into treatment, and it just turned out to be a disaster, and they've now reversed it. So I don't see drugs becoming legalized at widespread at any state level, excuse me, because it failed so miserably in Oregon. But I do see that we'll probably have continued restrictions on marijuana for some time to come. And that's all I got, Jessica.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Bill. We appreciate your attendance today. We're happy to be able to present this information to you. We also would like to thank our sponsor, Drug Pack. Their contact information is on the screen. If you are interested in talking to them about how their software can help the drug testing business that you do, please reach out to them. We also wanted to remind you that today's presentation qualified for continuing education credits from HRCI and for SHRM for those who attended the live presentation, and we'll send you out the codes for those associations so that you can apply for those credits. And with that, that concludes today's presentation. We thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.